So chapter 4 in the laws of prayer, in Hot Tefillah, deals mainly with those different factors that need to be taken care of in order to make the prayer that you're going to pray among one of the 3 daily prayers, to make it count as fulfillment for that specific fixed prayer in the day. If you don't take care of any of the following 5 matters, then that prayer will need to be said again while taking care of the matter that was neglected the first time one prayed. So this is how it begins. Perek Revi'i, the 4th chapter. There are 5 things that withhold prayer, even though its time has arrived. The purity of hands, the covering of nakedness, the purity of the location where one prays, and matters that disturb the individual, and the intention of the heart. So purity of the hands, what is implied? So what is implied by purity of the hands? That one washes his hands with water until his joint. The word for wrist in Hebrew is simply joint. Your wrist is called perek. The perek. And afterwards he should pray. If a person was going on his way and the time for prayer arrived and he didn't have with him water, what should he do? If there was between himself and the water 4 milin, a mil is an ancient measurement. Let me see if I can give you a pretty accurate definition as to how much a mil is. So it says in the commentary, Kol mil hu alapayim amah, kilometer. So it says a mil is roughly what today is called a kilometer. It's 2,000 amma. And amma is also a measurement from here to here, from your hand to your elbow. I think it's often referred to as a cubit, the word amma is. So a mil is 2,000 cubits roughly. So if there was, if he did not have any water with him, but there was between himself and water no more than 4,000, than 4 mil, it's roughly 4 kilometers. Shehem Shemonat Alafim Amma, which is 8,000 cubits. Therefore he should walk unto the water and wash his hands. And afterwards he prays. Alright, so you see that washing your hands is a very, very important thing when it comes to fulfilling the obligation for a fixed daily prayer. We're not talking about spontaneous personal prayer here. So if there was more than 8,000 cubits, if there was more than roughly 4 kilometers to the water, then he merely rubs his hands so then he wipes his hands with pebbles or with clumps of dust or dirt, and then he can pray. It's interesting to note that this particular instruction as to what one does when he needs to pray the obligatory prayer and he doesn't have water available, this method of dealing with a situation is also brought in the Quran. Just another of many commonalities. Continuing, we're now on the 3rd law, بَمَاذَا بُرِمَ مُرِيم? With what does the law that we just read regard? لَفَنَا, when the water is before him. لَفَنَا. أَبَلْ إِمْ هَيَا مَقُمْ هَمَّا يَمْلَأَ حَرَا. If the water, if the place where water was located was behind him, إِنْ مَحْعِيرِنَ لَحَزُورِ لَأَحَرَا, then he's not obligated to go back behind where he came, go back to where he came from. إِلَى عَدْ مِيل, except for up to a mil, except for up to a kilometer. So if the water, there's water not in front of you, within 4 kilometers roughly, then he will not be obligated to backtrack more than 1 kilometer in order to reach water. But if he passed up water more than roughly a kilometer, then he's not obligated to go back. Rather, he simply rubs his hands, gave examples of like with dirt or small pebbles, and then he prays. With what is this regard when he only purifies for prayer only his hands? So in what situation does he only have to purify his hands? بشار تفلت حسم التفلات شحريت. So he only needs to purify his hands for all the other prayer, any other prayers he's going to say of the obligatory prayers, except for the morning prayer, shahrit. Right? I didn't say this, but I know from reading other, I know from having already read this, that anytime you pray the Amidah, even if it's not an obligatory version of the Amidah, even if you're doing it voluntarily, giving a voluntary prayer, but it's based on the Amidah, then you need to wash your hands beforehand. Alright, continuing. So, we just read that purifying of one's hands is the only obligation for bodily purification that is required for prayer with regard to any of the prayers of the Amidah, except for the morning prayer, Shaharit, Abul Shaharit. But for Shaharit, for the morning prayer, he needs to do the following. He must wash his face, hands, and feet. And then he should pray. And if he was far from the water, then he merely rubs his hands alone and prays. So if he was far from water in this situation in the morning, even though in the morning he should wash his face, hands, and feet, if there was not water available, he only needs to rub his hands. He doesn't need to rub his face or feet. I think that makes for a more nicely kept prayer person. Can't imagine praying all filthy and dusty. Anyway. So anyone who has any of the ritual types of impurity that are mentioned in the Torah, all he has to do is wash his hands, and then he's able to pray just like a regular person who is not in a state of ritual impurity. So if a person is in a state of biblical ritual impurity, any kind of impurity, having to do with more than just the hands, he does not need to do any special kind of additional washing or go to a mikvah in order to pray, in order to have his prayer regarded as fulfilling his obligation. All he needs to do is wash his hands, no different from somebody who is not in a state of ritual impurity. This is the case even if he would be able to immerse himself and thereby ascend out of the state of ritual impurity. Despite this, his immersion for the sake of ritual purity of the whole body does not hold him back from fulfilling his obligation to pray. Everybody with me? If anyone has any questions, just speak up. Alright, continuing. And we already clarified. שעזרת תיקנה שלא יקרא בעל קרי בלבד דברי תורה עד שיתבע. So we already clarified that Ezra the Sofer, the same Ezra mentioned in the Bible, that under his leadership, the Beit Din HaGadol and his generation made an edict that an individual who had an emission should not learn words of Torah or even pray. And unless he immerses himself. So I was mistaken. So in Ezra's generation, they only made a decree that a person who had an emission from below is not able to read words of Torah until he's immersed. And then the Beit Din that stood after him in the next generation, they also made an edict that even to pray, one should not even pray unless he immerses his whole body after he had some sort of an emission. And they go on to explain that this was not because of a ritual status, a status of ritual impurity or purity. Okay, but rather is for a different reason. Rather, the reason for this edict that they instituted was so that the students of the sages would not constantly be with their wives having excessive amounts of marital relations, like chickens. I didn't make that up, that's what's written here. And for this reason, they made an edict regarding the necessity of immersion only for one who had an emission. And they made him an exception to all the other impurities, meaning anybody who had any other kind of impurity, he was able to pray. Okay, only someone who had an emission was not permitted to pray unless he immersed himself. And this wasn't a Torah obligation. This was a rabbinic institution, a rabbinic limitation on him, to make him feel pressed to lessen the amount of times he has relations with his wife. Not that he shouldn't have relations with his wife, but it's talking about having relations excessively. So it was a preventative measure. Therefore, they would say during the time that this edict was established, during the time that this edict still existed, שאפילו זר שראה קרי ונידע שפעולתו שכבת זרע והמשמשת שראה נידע צריכים בבילה לקריאת שמע וכן לתפילה מפני הקרי. So they used to say during the time of this takana, during the time of this edict, that even a person who had a non-seminal emission, if he saw an emission, even if it was non-seminal, or a woman who was menstruating, who had some kind of an emission coming from her husband, or let me check on what this means. Okay. Or even a woman who had relations and then she saw blood. Okay. So all of these also would need to be immersed before they would be able to fulfill their obligations for reciting Kriyat Shema or for prayer, right? Because of the edicts regarding emissions. أفعل بي كنطمئن. So they determined that these people who I just listed would need to be immersed because of that edict that was created, a rabbinic edict, they would need to be immersed, even based on that rabbinic decree, even though from the Torah they were in a state of impurity. Let me turn this off. Sorry for the disruption. I don't know how to turn it off. Well, I'll just sit on it. Okay. So from the fact that these different people who had different types of emissions were explained to be obligated by a rabbinic decree not to pray until they're immersed, from that you can see that from the Torah they were understood to be permitted to pray even without immersion from the Torah's law regarding the matters of prayer. And thus is the law, the Rambam writes, for this type of immersion that was originally established in Ezra's generation was not established for reasons of purity, but rather it was a decree, alright? Rather it was a decree not because of ritual purity, but merely in order to keep the students of the sages from constantly being with their wives in a marital context. And also, already has this edict, this decree that we've just been talking about, it has already been cancelled, even with regard to prayer. Because this decree, this edict of the Beit Din, it did not spread throughout the people of Israel. And the people at large were not able to fulfill its demands, its requirements. It's important to note here it's important to note that here where it's talking about the takana, this edict being nullified or cancelled, only certain types of edicts can be cancelled. Only certain types of edicts from the Torah, from the Sanhedrin can be cancelled. There are types of edicts from the Sanhedrin that cannot be cancelled by a later Sanhedrin. The main difference, if my memory serves me right, is that those edicts or decrees that the Sanhedrin establishes in order to distance us from violating a Torah prohibition, those decrees cannot be nullified in a later generation. But a decree such as this one, which was instituted not to prevent us from violating a Torah prohibition, but rather to strengthen our focus on more pertinent matters, those types can be nullified in future generations, especially if it is observed that the decree instituted by the Sanhedrin did not spread throughout all of the people of Israel. All the more so when it's a decree that was established or decreed by a specific rabbi who had no authority to make such decrees in the first place. Continuing in the 6th law of chapter 4. So there is a widespread practice in the area of Spain and Babylon, which would mean that this practice in Spain at that time probably originated from the area of Babylon, modern-day Iraq. So there is a widespread practice. I think we have a commercial. Everybody there? Going back to the 6th law of chapter 4. It says, that there is a widespread practice among the Jews of Spain and of Shinar. Shinar is a term for the area of Iraq or Babylon. So by saying Minhag Pashut Bisfarad u Shinar, that there is a widespread practice in Spain and in the area of Iraq, the Rambam is essentially saying that in his time the majority of Jews had the particular practice he's about to describe. That is because during his time most Jews were living in those areas. Most Jews in the Rambam's times were not Ashkenazim, they were not European Jews. So what is that practice that he's referring to? It's not a binding halakha, but it was a practice that was widely kept. Alright? It probably meant that they understood it to be a decent and proper way to prepare for serving God, but not strictly binding. That practice is she'en ba'an kari mitfalal ad shur ohas kol b'soro b'mayim, that one who had an emission of any sort, like we already listed the different types, that he doesn't pray until he rinses his entire body with water. So this is different from the original takana, the original edict, that one needs to immerse in a mikvah, which is a specific type of pool of water. So although that didn't spread with the Jewish people, it seems like a more lenient, looser way of fulfilling that original obligation continued to exist even after that obligation became nullified. This is voluntary; they voluntarily accepted it upon themselves. Alright, so why did they have this custom? The Rambam writes, Mishum, because of the verse that states in Amos, the book of Amos, chapter 4, verse 12, Hikon niqrat Elohecha Yisrael, that you, Israel, should prepare for meeting your God. With what does this pertain? Both with a sick or a healthy individual who had relations. But a sick person who saw an emission against his will is exempt. He is patur min rahisah. He's exempt from the rinsing. And that is all in accord with this practice that was widely practiced at this time. Right? So he writes, there is no practice or custom that one who had an emission against his will would need to rinse off before he prays. And likewise for the one who had a non-seminal emission, or a woman who menstruated or had blood together with the remainder of what her husband had done. Also with these things, there is no practice that they be strict to rinse their whole bodies before they can fulfill their prayer obligations. Obviously they should rinse, but not required to rinse the entire body. Rather, what do? They merely wipe themselves. They wipe themselves off and they rinse their hands, and then they can pray. Right? So that is the first part of the 5 things mentioned in chapter 4 that one must take care of and make sure that he does before he fulfills his obligation to pray. This first one was with regard to purity, and at a most minimal level, one is only required to wash his hands before all of the prayers, and in the morning prayer one should wash his face and feet. There was an ancient practice, it is referred to by different major leaders of the Jewish people in the Middle Ages and the period of the Go'anim, to wash your hands, face, and feet, not only for the morning prayers but also for any prayer. However, that was regarded as a proper thing to do, but not something which, if not done, would invalidate your prayer. Needless to say, this may have something to do with the Muslim practice of washing face, hands, and feet before praying. So the obligation to cover nakedness before prayer. What is implied? So what is implied by the obligation to cover nakedness? Even though one covered his nakedness in the manner that he's required to cover for reciting Shema, he should not pray until he covers also his heart. He also needs to cover his heart before he prays. Whereas in order to fulfill the obligation for reciting Shema, he needs to cover his nakedness, but is not required to cover his heart. But if he didn't cover his heart, or if he was prevented for something beyond his control, and was not and did not have with what to cover his heart, so if he didn't cover his heart, even though he technically should if he could, so long as he covers his nakedness, he is able to pray and fulfill his obligation. And from the outset, he shouldn't do this. The purity of the location wherein one prays. What is implied? So a person should not pray in a place wherein there is filth. Right? Tinofet means filth. I am just curious what they give them here. So in the laws of Kriyat Shema, it describes or explains Tinofet as a place wherein there is feces or excrement of any type, including urine. So one should not pray in a place wherein there is any sort of excrement. Also, one should not pray in a place wherein people shower. Earlier explained in the laws of Kriyat Shema, this is any place where the majority of people unclothe themselves in this location. And also one should not pray in a bathroom, nor in a place of trash or filth that does not necessarily have excrement, nor should one pray in any location that doesn't usually have a state of purity. So any place that is not usually clean, a place that doesn't usually is not usually absent of feces and filth, a person shouldn't pray in such a place unless he checks it. Okay, so if he checked the place that is not a bathroom, not a wash house, and it usually is not absent, not void of excrement, but it's possible that it doesn't have, so it should be checked. If it fulfills the obligation and doesn't have filth and excrement in it, then he can pray. The general principle of the matter is that any place wherein one is not permitted to recite Shema, he should not pray there. He is also not permitted to pray there. And just as we distance ourselves from excrement and urine and bad smells and from the dead and from the sight of nakedness for reciting Shema, so likewise with prayer. In the laws of Shema, it is explained that a woman's uncovered hair is also regarded as nudity with regards to the laws of prayer in Kriyat Shema, and even to see her little finger is regarded as seeing nakedness if one looks at it in a lustful manner. So you shouldn't be praying with your eyes open, but if you are praying and your eyes are open, you should not be praying in the presence of a woman who you are probably going to be aroused by. Likewise for Kriyat Shema. Likewise really for anything, whether you're a woman looking at a guy possibly who whatever. So now into the ninth law. يتقلل ومنصوص بمقامه. So if a person prayed, and while he's praying he found excrement in the place where he's praying, فإيل وعطاه نبني شلوب وذق عن شيء الله يتقلل حجر يتقلل بمقام طاهر. So if a person found excrement, noticed excrement in the place where he's praying in the midst of prayer, or after he prayed, since he transgressed, meaning he didn't check the place before starting to pray, he should therefore say the prayer again in a location of purity, a place without excrement or urine or any of these disgusting things. So what do you do if a person was in the midst of prayer and he noticed that there is excrement before him? If he noticed the excrement before him in the midst of prayer, then if he is able to, he should walk forward until the excrement is behind him at least 4 amot. That's about 4 cubits. So about 4 arm breadth distance behind him. Alright. And if he's not, if he's not able to get it behind him 4 amot, that literally means that he should remove it to the sides. So that means, as explains here, that he should turn his body so that the excrement would be to his side and not in front of him. This is in case that he's not able to back up. And if he is not able to either have the excrement be removed from before him by moving forward, and nor is he able to have the excrement put at his side by turning his body, in that case he should simply stop praying, and therefore he should relocate and not pray again until he has placed himself in a location wherein there is no excrement or any other thing which would cause him to not be able to fulfill these 5 obligations that one needs to take care of when praying. I'm sorry. גדולי החכמים לא היו מתפללים בבית בבית שיש בו שחור ולא בבית שיש בו מוריות בעת עיבושה מפני שריח רע אף על פי שהמקום טהור. The greatest of the sages, they wouldn't even pray in a room wherein there was fermenting liquids, or a place wherein there was murios. The commentary explains that that is a type of dog. Fish in Hebrew is dog, so I said dog. Dog oil. Murios is explained in his commentary as being a type of fish oil, which is mixed with yeast and salt, and people used to dip bread into it for eating, but apparently had a bad smell. So the great sages used to not pray in places such as these because of the bad smells that they produced, even though the location was technically pure. I think we will continue next week at the 10th chapter of the 10th law of chapter 4 and the laws of prayer. You guys have a great Shabbat. Kind of quiet today. If anyone has any questions, please ask. 10, 9